like you're in like some wherever it is, some out of the way place, and you sign up for a lottery. You always get, you always win the dinner for two at some local restaurant you're never ever going to get to.
Next time, as long as it's valid for whatever. Right.
Well, we actually did that in Calgary. We won like their big grand prize thing. It was a huge grand prize. We got like a T-shirt and a CD.
Good evening, Facebook Live, and welcome to night 2 of See and Learn 2019. Thank you guys for tuning in with us. We're super excited for this evening. We got 2 awesome experts that have studied mosquitoes. So we're going to learn all about mosquitoes and one of the world's second most deadly insects. We have experts Anton and Irka here with us tonight. So stay tuned and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Well, they're going to talk about one of the ones that's the second most deadly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's what Irka did.
No, nothing at all.
Yeah, so we didn't do the loop. We're just going to go with it because I didn't know.
The mosquitoes are known to repel rain.
Okay.
I think they're trying to make it. Better be.
I don't get absolutely no promotion for it, but I should advertise.
That's not a bad idea. That's deductible.
Right?
I think it's tax deductible.
It's not in Canada.
Well, I do run a non-profit event. Yes,
Yeah, there you go.
Well, actually, it would be, sort of.
Was, I didn't even see it here. There was advertising something like cloud something. I put it not there, obviously, but when's it drawing? End of the month. So they'll let you know. Should not be up.
Ready to rock?
You know this island needs is a cable car.
Sorry.
Seriously.
I'll just get you on the side.
Same, because Olga's going to do testing. 1, 2. Test. Hello, testing. It's on, right? Testing. There we go. All right. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you guys, first off, for braving out the weather. You guys are awesome for showing up. Looks like we got some blue skies coming in, so it's going to be a good evening. And we're actually going to change things up tonight. We're going to have the public health doctor for Saba do the introduction for our 2 experts tonight. So please welcome Olga Fisher.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to see you all. Well, as you said, my name is Olga Fisher. I'm the public health doctor for Saba. I haven't been here for that long. I arrived here in August, but I'm very happy to see you here. And tonight we're going to talk about mosquitoes, and that's actually one of the things in my work that I find quite that are very impactful that could be dealt with. Because as you've all noticed the last weeks, the amount of mosquitoes have been really rising. I'm sure you've all noticed, can't be missed. And that actually poses us a bit of a threat, because if there would be a dengue introduction, we would be in big trouble here on Saba. So that's why I'm worried, and I'm very happy that we're going to talk about mosquitoes tonight. On Saba, we already do a lot of things about mosquitoes. We have the lovely vector control unit led by Randall Johnson, as you all know, and the vector control guys are there in the back, and they all try to keep us safe by going house by house. Yeah, thank you, very good. by going house by house and looking for breeding sites and reminding you all that we should get rid of these breeding sites to decrease the chance of mosquitoes becoming more. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of more work that needs to be done, and for that we need to really understand better how everything works with mosquitoes. So for the last years, I have to say, we've been very lucky to get a little bit of funding from the Dutch government to look into mosquitoes here on Saba a little bit more, and that's actually what is also going to be presented here tonight. So I have to thank the Dutch government for that funding, and I also have to thank I have to look that up. The Science Against Scurvy and Insect-Borne Diseases Fund that also made it possible for these experts to actually come out to Saba for this presentation. And See and Learn for the opportunity to get this mosquito exposure. So thanks all those people. And for now I'd like to introduce the experts, because that's the most important thing, of course. First of all, there's Dr. Anthony Cornel. He grew up in South Africa, and he has a lot of experience on mosquito research. He worked at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, mostly on African malaria vectors. Tonight he will be presenting on mosquito diversity and behaviors, so that will be very interesting. Thank you for being here. And also there's Irka Bargielowski. She has a broad background in ecology, and this brought her to studying the mating behavior of Aedes aegypti, which is also a very common mosquito here. Aedes aegypti is the main vector of yellow fever, dengue fever, Zika virus, and chikungunya viruses. And this puts actually over half the world's population at risk of disease. And tonight she will be presenting on the genetics of Aedes aegypti in Saba, St. Eustatius, and St. Maarten. And that can help us develop a more specific mosquito control program. So thank you very much for being here. And first of all, I'd like to give the floor to Anton.
All right, so I'll stand here, so hopefully you can all see the screen. And it's not often that I'm presenting in such a wonderful setting with such a wonderful background. I'm normally in a classroom with an air conditioner and freezing to death. So I hope that you're going to get some perspective of how diverse mosquitoes are. You read very little about mosquitoes in the newspaper, and it's normally about a disastrous situation. And so knowledge that you get from mosquitoes becomes very, very small. So I'm hoping you're going to realize that they do play a role in the ecosystem, and they are quite diverse. So I'm just going to give you snippets of information about some of the mosquitoes that do unusual things. That's not me.
That's the next one? Yep. And one more. And then that's you.
All right. Okay. So you're welcome to ask me questions. Just, my name's Anton. Call me Anton. Easy. So before we discuss a little more about the behaviors of the mosquito, it's really critical that you understand that mosquitoes have a life cycle, right? Quite a complex life cycle. And so we typically have an adult, and an adult will lay eggs, and the eggs will hatch, and all mosquitoes go through what they call 4 instars. So they get bigger, bigger, and bigger. And then between each of these stages, they will molt and release their exoskeleton and then become a little bigger. And so all mosquitoes go through 4 instars. There's no exceptions. Then they'll go through an intermediate stage between a larva and adult known as a pupa. This stage of their life cycle is very important for them to obtain nutrients. So all they do is eat, and they eat microorganisms and algae and little bits of detritus in the water bodies that they're found in. The pupa has no mouth parts, so it doesn't feed at all. Most mosquitoes in this stage of their life cycle takes about 1 week to 2 weeks to develop. And it may vary depending on the temperature of the water. The hotter the water, a little faster they will grow. But there are exceptions. For instance, there are some mosquitoes that breed in crab holes. So you know the crabs on the coastline are they're in little holes, and there's water in those crab holes. And some mosquitoes only breed in crab holes, and they will live up to 4 years as larvae. It's a permanent source of water, very safe environment, and so they develop very, very slowly. So there are exceptions to that. In terms of pupae, no exceptions. They will only survive for 2 to 3 days. That's it. As I say, they cannot feed, closed mouth parts, and all it is an intermediary casing that allows for massive changes in the body to form the adult. And then they emerge as adults. And then a lot of people ask me, well, how long does an adult live? And of course, most adults will emerge during the peak season, wet season, when the environment is favorable, and they typically will live 2 to 3 weeks. Most not much longer than that. Obviously, it depends also on the temperature, on the humidity, whether they can find a nice environment to rest in. That all changes how long they are able to live for. However, during the season, when it's not favorable for them to live, they can undergo some physiological changes that allows them to live for much longer. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. And so that's an overwintering strategy that they use. So there are various kinds of egg shapes that they lay. And so there are some mosquitoes that lay eggs that look like a little pincushion that's laid under a leaf that's floating on the surface of the water. You get others that lay individual eggs like this on just above the surface of the water. You get others that lay eggs like this. It's a little like it's what they call a raft. It's a boat of all these individual eggs. So there may be as many as 500 eggs. And that floats on the surface of the water. And these have to hatch within 2 to 3 days. They cannot withstand any drying out whatsoever. These eggs here are commonly laid by what they call Aedes mosquitoes, and they can withstand a certain amount of desiccation, drying out. So there are some, and I'll show you an example later, where these eggs can live up to 2 to 3 years in some parts of Africa, because rain is not very consistent in Africa, and so there's a survival strategy for them to live longer periods where they can withstand desiccation. And then there's others that lay individual eggs that float directly on the surface of the water. They see these little air sacs, these little bits of air that keeps them afloat, and these also cannot withstand any desiccation. They have to hatch within 2 to 3 days. And these are eggs that are laid by Anopheles mosquitoes that vector malaria in Africa and South America and Asia. Then there's the larva. And most larvae look more or less like this, where they have a breathing tube from which they obtain air directly from the air. And then they have the head region here, which has lots of hairs on them that forms like a little brush. And it brushes in all the microorganisms into their mouth and into their gut, which they feed. There are a few mosquitoes where you can see here they have very long gills. See those long gills? These mosquitoes never come to the surface to breathe. They get all the air they need directly through those gills. So they stay at the bottom of the water, and they're found in forest regions in North America. And you can see that different species have different lengths of their siphons. And then there's the Anopheles, the malaria vectors, where the larvae essentially lie parallel to the surface of the water. So they swim like this. And as they swim like this in the water, that's how they're absorbing nutrients directly that's on the water surface. And then there's others like this where they have to breathe and lie at an oblique angle to the surface of the water and then essentially suck in organisms that are floating within the water body. Here's an example of pupae. And as I said, the pupae only live for 2 to 3 days and then they become adults. And then there's the adult. And you have male adults and of course you have female adults, right? And the males typically have fluffy antennae. And the females don't have fluffy antennae. So you can easily tell males apart from females just by looking at their heads. Obviously they have different genitalia, and this is an example of malaria vectors mating. And I'll talk to you a bit about their unusual mating behavior. So, worldwide, I often get asked this question: how many species of mosquitoes are there? So there's, as of February of 2018, there were 3,556 species described worldwide. That number has changed very little since a year ago, but that's more or less the number of species that have been described. So, how many species of mosquitoes occur on Saba and St. Eustatius? Okay, remember I said there's 3,500 species. How many do you think live on Saba and St. Eustatius? About 5. Okay. So there they are. They're your species. So it's aegypti, which is the most common mosquito here. Then there's Culex quinquefasciatus, which is the second most common, and they occur on both islands. Then there's Aedes basquii, which only occurs on Saba. There's Irkas, which occur in very, very low numbers. They are salt marsh mosquitoes. And then there is Bicolcatus, which is found on both islands. And then there's Toxorynchites guadeloupensis, which used to be found and hasn't been found for several years. But it was a species that occurred here, and it may still occur here, it just hasn't been seen very often. So how ancient are mosquitoes? When did they evolve? Well, they evolved essentially during the period of the dinosaurs. So they go back 30 to 80 million years ago. So they adapted to feeding on dinosaurs when they evolved. And they've been around ever since. And here's an image of the famous stupid movie, Jurassic Park, where supposedly they were able to clone all the species of dinosaurs from the blood of a mosquito that was fossilized in a piece of amber. Because we all know that the DNA in amber is not complete, so there's no ways you could create a whole organism from the DNA in amber because it's broken up and most of it is destroyed. But nevertheless, it's a movie, right? But certainly that's when mosquitoes, we know, were around and may have even evolved a little bit beforehand. But they've maintained essentially their blood feeding abilities based on what they essentially evolved with 90 million years ago. Obviously, mosquitoes are of interest because they carry and vector very dangerous diseases, right, which we are all concerned about. And of course, they cause discomfort to people. So here's an example of a person that was bitten by a mosquito, developed a big bump. And of course, people ask me, well, why do some people react more than others? And that's entirely due to the fact that everybody's immune system is different. And so you're reacting to spit, essentially enzymes and protein that the mosquito is ejecting into your body. What it's ejecting into you are enzymes and proteins that stop your blood from clotting. So it's anticoagulants, because it can't suck a dry clot of blood. It's got to be moist. They also secrete enzymes that are called vasodilators. So what they is it expands the capillaries. So the wall of the capillary becomes thinner, so it can obtain blood easier. So they spit quite a large amount of proteins and enzymes into your body. that's foreign, and your body reacts to it, tries to kill it, and so that's what causes the bump. And you scratch and itch, and if you scratch too much, then you open up a wound, and if you open up a wound, then you can get a bacterial infection and a secondary infection, and so obviously try and avoid scratching too much so that you create a wound. And if it really itches, the best thing to do is just get a little bit of alcohol or a little bit of aftershave and just dab it on, and it will help alleviate the itch rather than scratching yourself to death.
If you don't get a reaction to it like that, are you're still being injected with the
Sure.
vasodilators and
Sure.
all that, but your body's just not
It's just
responding to it.
it's just used to it. Yeah. Yeah. So most larvae are filter feeders, as I told you earlier. So do you see these little brushes here? It's essentially like a baleen whale. All this little hairs, and they're continuously moving and brushing in nutrients. There are some exceptions. So here is a mosquito that's quite large, and you can see it's eating another mosquito. Can you see there? So there are some mosquitoes that are predatory. So this is what the adult looks like that emerged from this larva. It's a large mosquito, beautiful purple, orange colors. And this mosquito here belongs to the genus Toxorynchides, and they only feed on nectar. So both males and females do not take any blood, just nectar feeders. But their larvae are quite important because they are predators, and they eat other mosquitoes that breed in tree holes, rot holes, and in plants that hold water. So you remember, one of the species that used to be found on Saba was a Toxorynchides. So we do have, or there were some Toxorynchides on Saba, and hopefully they still do exist. So people ask me, well, why can't we use this mosquito as a means of biological control? The problem is it's a very difficult mosquito to rear in large numbers. If you could rear 15 million of these things and then release all 15 million, yes, that would make an impact. But to rear that number of a predatory mosquito is very hard to do. And also what happens is only one lives. Only one wins the battle in a tree hole because they also eat each other. So if a female lays 100 eggs, they will also start eating other species as well as their own kind. And so invariably after 2 to 3 weeks, there's only one big larva left. So only the dominant one lives, and generally they take about a month to develop. But during that period of a month, they will eat probably, maybe 10 to 20 mosquitoes a day. That's where they originally were found in, yeah. But they will also lay in artificial containers, such as and in tires, in essentially dark breeding places, yeah. I've never found one in Bromelia, no. Not to say that there's no exceptions, but generally no. So most male and female mosquitoes seek moisture to live. They always need some carbohydrates, some sugar to survive. And the theory is that they mostly feed on nectar, but they don't only feed on nectar, because in some parts of Africa, especially in the southern Sahara Desert, there's not a flower to be seen. It's as dry as anything. So they are opportunistic moisture feeders. And so, for instance, they will take moisture from a cow or a goat that's urinating just to obtain some nutrients to survive. Otherwise, they'll just desiccate and die. So some species of mosquitoes have taken nectar feeding and sugar feeding to the absolute extreme. So, of course, you remember I mentioned that we have the Toxorynchides, and it has this long proboscis that looks like the beak of a sunbird. So that's an example of convergent evolution, where they essentially have to develop the same shaped mouthpart to be able to suck nectar. Then we have a group of mosquitoes that belong to the genus Malaria. And what they do to obtain enough sugar is they actually insert their proboscis into the mouth of a cocktail ant and then tell the cocktail ant that I'm essentially another cocktail ant and I need food. So it fools the ant to believe that it's feeding one of its babies. And in that way, it obtains enough of sugar for it to survive in some environments. So there's quite a diversity in their way in which they survive and behave. And these mosquitoes generally occur in the tropical forest regions where cocktail ants are quite common. In terms of blood feeding, they feed on a variety of hosts, of vertebrates. So in case you didn't believe me, here's a mosquito that's actually feeding on a frog. It didn't come out that well, but here's the frog. There's the mosquito that I've just exploded there. So it's actually feeding on a frog that's calling at night. They also feed on snakes. Mosquitoes love feeding on snakes, especially egg eaters. When the scales are slightly opened and there's this membrane in between the scales where it's softer and they feed in between the scales. And you remember I told you that essentially these organisms were around 90 million years ago when they evolved, and they've just maintained this blood feeding activity all that time. The fact that they feed on us is only a character of behavior that evolved very, very much later in their evolution. Most mosquitoes feed on birds. Birds are their favorite host. And that's not surprising, because all you do is if you take a chicken and you pull all of its feathers out, what does it look like? It looks like a Tyrannosaurus rex with a beak, right? And that's where they're derived from. They're essentially bipedal dinosaurs. That's where birds essentially evolved from. So they've just maintained that bipedal dinosaur feeding behavior, which is what a bird is. And so here is a bird that occurs in Hawaii, and you can see the mosquito feeding around the eye where it can get through the feathers. Unfortunately, island birds are very, very susceptible to avian malaria. So there are 5 species of malaria that attack humans. None of those human malarias affect birds. There are about 87 species of Plasmodium that affect birds that don't affect people. And here's just a classic example of where on the island of Hawaii there were no mosquitoes until after the Second World War. When mosquitoes were introduced into Hawaii, when equipment after the war was over was brought back and dumped on the island of Hawaii, and there were mosquitoes breeding in that equipment that was brought from Asia. Those mosquitoes adapted to live in Hawaii and brought with it avian malaria. The birds in Hawaii had never been exposed to malaria, and they were extremely susceptible to it, and it killed them. So as a consequence, after the Second World War, all these species of birds that are endemic in Hawaii are now extinct. And it's extinct because of avian malaria. There are endemic birds here on Saba, for instance. And so there's always a possibility that you may get an unusual species of avian malaria introduced into Saba that would also affect the birds here. So not only do mosquitoes affect people, but they also decimate wildlife, and some important rare species of birds and animals and lizards are affected by the diseases that they carry. Yes?
Do mosquito bites annoy the other species and animals in the way that they do humans?
Yeah, they do. Yeah. Especially if it bites you around the eye. I don't care whether you're a bird or a reptile, it must irritate, and they do. Because you can actually see it. You know, if we put a bird in a cage of mosquitoes and they bite around the eyes, the birds are continuously trying to rub the mosquitoes off. They close their eyes. So yes. And so what they do is they tend to bite the birds at night when the birds are asleep and roosting, so they don't feel it so much. Yeah. And they also bite birds on their legs between the scales.
Is there any way of protecting invasive species of mosquitoes?
Well, you got to have a good vector control program to be able to try and keep them out, and you got to have a good surveillance program to be able to detect them when they first arrive, because it's easier to get rid of them when their numbers are low than once they've spread and their numbers are high. So, some species of mosquito can also feed on fish. Can anybody tell me how a mosquito can feed on a fish? So you've never seen mosquitoes dive into the sea and feed on a you never seen that? You haven't lived. So here we are. So here's mud skippers. So these are fish that come out to out of the sea during certain parts of the day and night, and there are mosquitoes that are feeding on the sea. All these mosquitoes on this little mud skipper. There's one here. There's one here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 feeding on this little mud skipper. So these are mosquitoes that only feed on these fish. So it's a very, very tight relationship. We've also recently found there are some species that actually feed on worms and on leeches, which is a reasonably, it was found relatively recently. And these species of mosquitoes are Uranotenias that are very small, very tiny mosquitoes that just feed on those kinds of animals, and they don't feed on people and they don't feed on birds. Once again, very, very tight relationship between the host and the mosquito. So we all know that some mosquitoes do feed on people. And of course, the world's deadliest animal is a mosquito. It's an Anopheles mosquito that carries malaria. And a lot of people die from malaria every year. Currently, about 250,000 people die from malaria a year due to the bite of Anopheles. So this is what an Anopheles mosquito looks like. And that one's actually feeding on my arm. And what these mosquitoes do here is, the Anopheles like to do this, is while they're feeding, they're actually pooping out parts of the blood that they don't want. And they try and absorb as much of the protein of the blood to make as many eggs as possible. So this, not all Anopheles mosquitoes carry malaria and they infect humans. There are only some species, but the most important one is Anopheles gambiae and Anopheles colutzii, which is widespread in Africa. Before we knew that, and I'm talking going back now 120 years ago, before they discovered that mosquitoes carry malaria, malaria was always thought to be caused by a species of tree in Africa. And so this is the tree which was known as the fever tree, and if you rub your hand on the tree, your hand picks up this yellow dust. And they thought this was the cause of malaria for many, many years. And this tree here loves water, and so it was always found in parts of Africa where there was lots of water and where there were lots of Anopheles mosquitoes. And that tree is known as the fever tree and known as Acacia xanthophyllae. So it's thought that the human malarias are derived from malarias that affected primates, such as the gorillas and the chimpanzees. And it's derived from there. Of course, chimpanzees and gorillas have been around quite a long time ago, so the primate plasmodiums probably evolved, 2 to 3 million years ago. To cut a long story short about malaria, the take-home message currently these days is that the fight against malaria is not over. We're trying, and we're trying very hard. And the problem is that Anopheles gambiae, which is the major vector of malaria, is becoming more and more resistant to the insecticides that we've used to try and reduce their numbers. When you go to Africa, a lot of people use bed nets. And the bed nets are coated with insecticide, so that when the mosquitoes, so it's not only a barrier, but also if the mosquito touches the bed net, it picks up the insecticide and picks it up on their tarsal pads, and then the mosquitoes will lick their tarsal pads and ingest the poison and kill it. Now the mosquitoes are becoming resistant to those chemicals. Not only than that, the mosquitoes are also not flying inside people's homes anymore, where they used to bite people when people were sleeping. Now they're adapting, because of the insecticides, to feed people earlier in the night when people are still outdoors having dinner. So the behavior of the mosquito is adapting. So now, all our measures that we use to control the malaria vectors indoors is having less and less effect. Because we use bed nets, and of course we also used indoor residual spraying, where people would spray the walls of houses with DDT and various other chemicals. So the mosquitoes are shifting their behavior, so now trying to control a mosquito that's flying outdoors is a lot more challenging and difficult. And what's made a big contribution to forcing them to change their behavior also is in the structure of the people's homes. This is a typical house where people used to live in Africa, where there was a gap between the roof and the wall of the house for movement of air so that the house wasn't that hot. Now, of course, people are living in houses like this, which is much more difficult environment for mosquitoes to get into. Then Irka's going to talk to you a little more about the second most dangerous animal on Earth. And that's because it's a vector of several other diseases that are of concern. And while you don't have Anopheles mosquitoes here that carry malaria, you do have this one in large numbers. So right now, I'm sure one or two of you are being bitten by this species of mosquito. Welcome to Saba. Yeah. So some mosquitoes are really colorful. So here's an example of a Sabathes that occurs in the forest in South America. And they have all these lovely hairs on their legs. And all of these hairs detect chemicals. And all these chemicals are used in their mating behavior. So Sabathes actually undergo a mating dance that lasts for several hours. So the male has to essentially coax the female to want him. And it does that by, first of all, emitting chemicals. Does she like those chemicals? And then, can I go and touch her with my legs? Maybe she doesn't like my legs and she'll fly away, and so I have to try again. And so these mating dances take several hours, and very, very sophisticated mating behavior. There are some mosquitoes, and most, in fact, that when they mate, it's very quick. So the males swarm. You see swarms of mosquitoes. And a female will fly through that swarm and will get grabbed by a male, and they'll fall to the ground, and before they hit the ground, he's already done his thing, and he's happy, and she's happy. So that's how it happens with a lot of Anopheles mosquitoes. You can see here that, as I said, we can identify and distinguish a lot of mosquitoes by just looking at their various colors. So here's a plate of showing mosquitoes that have different patterns of scales on their thoraces. And some look quite pretty. And especially when you look at this under a microscope, it's really quite impressive. You can see there's so much detail in such a tiny little organism. Then you have others that are orange, that occur in many parts of Africa, and these ones feed on birds, and these ones also carry avian malaria. Here's a beautiful mosquito, right? And so what's the first thing that strikes you about this mosquito? What strikes you about it? Right? The colors of its scales, sapphire colors, right, of its scales on the thorax. So this one's known as Uranotenia sapphirina, species sapphirina. And these occur in the southern parts of North America and feed on frogs. Very, very small mosquito, but very colorful. So let us say a few things about their mating behavior. So this is a typical swarm of mosquitoes, and this was above my head. So I was sitting in Africa, and I just took my camera and I took a photograph. And there were all these males. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's all these males that are buzzing around my head, and using essentially my head as what they call a lick. So something that attracts males to create a swarm is called a lick. So it can be a person, or it can be a tree that emits a certain smell. It can be the lighting of a certain effect that creates a lick with the males swarm. And the females hear the swarm. So the males are all buzzing, creating a certain frequency with their wing beats. And the females are actually detecting